Most people hear about America's massive debt and think, what would actually happen if they tried? And why is the US dollar? It sounds simple, right? After all, the US controls the dollar. If the government needs money, why not just create more and wipe out the debt? It seems like an easy solution. But the reality? Printing money doesn't solve problems, it creates them. And history has shown us that whenever a country tries this, disaster follows. So let's break it down. Why can't the US just print money and erase its debt? What would actually happen if they tried? And why is the US dollar different from any other currency in the world? To answer this, we first need to understand something most people don't realize. Money is not just paper, it represents value. It works because people trust it. The second the trust disappears, everything falls apart. What happens when a country prints money without limit? More goods, services, or resources. It just spreads, makes the money already in circulation worth less. Think about it like this. Imagine you have a pizza that's been sliced into 10 equal pieces. If you invite 10 friends over, each one gets a slice. But what if you suddenly decide to double the slices by cutting each one in half? Now there are 20 pieces instead of 10. But does anyone get more pizza? No, they just get smaller slices. That's exactly what happens when a country prints money. It doesn't create more goods, services, or resources. It just spreads the same value across more dollars. And when that happens, prices go up, and the value of each dollar goes down. This is called inflation. And if it gets out of control, it turns into hyperinflation. Let's look at real-world examples where this happened. In the early 2000s, Zimbabwe was facing its own money and switched to using the US dollar because it meant more money. At first it seemed like it was working. People had more cash in their hands. But very quickly, prices skyrocketed. A loaf of bread went from a few Zimbabwean dollars to millions. People had to carry wheelbarrows of cash just to buy groceries. The government kept printing more and more money, but it only made the situation worse. Eventually, Zimbabwe's currency collapsed completely. The government had to abandon its own money and switch to using the US dollar. Because when inflation gets out of control, money stops meaning anything. And once people lose trust in their currency, the economy falls apart. In the 2010s, Venezuela tried the same because no one wanted to accept a currency that was losing value struggled. The government needed more money, so they printed billions of new bills. And just like Zimbabwe, it backfired. Prices doubled, tripled, and then exploded. At one point, inflation was over 1,000,000%. That means something that cost $1 at the start of the year could cost $10,000 by the end. People's life savings became worthless overnight. And basic goods like food and medicine disappeared. Because no one wanted to accept a currency that was losing value every second. One of the worst examples of hyperinflation in history that followed, it helped pave the way for the rise of adult debt. And instead of raising taxes or cutting spending, they printed more money. What happened? Inflation spiraled out of control. People's paychecks lost value before they could even spend them. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day because by the evening, their wages weren't worth anything. Some people even burned stacks of money because it was cheaper than buying firewood. The economy collapsed completely, and the instability that followed, it helped pave the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler in World War II, because when money loses its value, societies fall apart. If printing money leads to disaster, why does the US when countries print too much money? Hyperinflation is that would destroy any other country's economy. Let's see, this changes everything. Next, we're going to break down why the US dollar is unique, why countries around the world rely on it, and how this stops America from collapsing, even when it prints trillions of dollars. If you've made it this far, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Because what comes next? It will change the way you see money forever. We've seen what happens when countries print too much money. Hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Weimar Germany showed us that when a government creates too much currency, it becomes worthless. But here's the big question. Why hasn't this happened to the United States? Why can the US print trillions of dollars, and yet the dollar still holds its value? The answer? Because the US dollar is different. It's not just America's currency, it's the world's currency. This is what makes the US unique. It allows the government to do things that would destroy any other country's economy. Let's break it down. When most countries print too much money, their currency collapses. How much money America prints? There's always demand for it. Because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. This means that governments, central banks, and businesses around the world rely on the dollar. They hold it in their reserves. They use it for trade. They buy oil, food, and raw materials with it. Right now, over 60% of the world's foreign currency reserves are in US dollars. No other currency comes close. This gives the US a huge advantage. Because no matter how much money America prints, there's always demand for US dollars worldwide. Countries need it to trade, businesses need it to operate internationally. And this means the US can print more money without seeing the same level of hyperinflation that destroyed other countries. But how did the US dollar become so powerful? It wasn't always this way. Before World War II, most of the world's economies were. The dollar was backed by gold. Countries could exchange theirs, and countries were struggling. So in 1944, leaders from 44 nations came together in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to create a new global financial system. What did they decide? They agreed that the US dollar would be the world's primary currency. Why? Because the US had the largest economy and the most gold reserves. Under this system, all major currencies were tied to the US dollar. The US dollar was backed by gold. Countries could exchange their dollars for physical gold at a fixed rate. This made the US dollar the most trusted currency in the world. But then something changed everything. For years, the US dollar was backed by gold, kept using it. And something even more important happened. Every dollar had to be supported by physical gold reserves. But in 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the gold standard. Now, the US could print as much money as it wanted. Most people expected this to weaken the dollar. But something unexpected happened. The dollar got stronger. Why? Because even though the US wasn't backing its money with gold anymore, the rest of the world still trusted the dollar. Other countries kept using it. And something even more important happened. The US made a deal with oil-rich nations to sell oil only in dollars. This led to the rise of the petrodollar. Here's the most important reason why the US can print money with dollars to do business on the global stage. No other mean. It means that most of the world's oil is bought and sold in US dollars. Let's say China wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia. They don't use Chinese yuan. They have to exchange their money for US dollars first. This creates massive demand for dollars worldwide. And as long as the world needs oil, countries will need US dollars. This is why the US can print money and still maintain global influence. Because every nation needs dollars to do business on the global stage. No other currency has this advantage. Can the US keep printing money forever? If the US, but then inflation skyrocketed, the worst. Russia want to replace it? And what could happen if the US stops trusting the US dollar? What happens if limits? Printing too much money still causes inflation. It weakens the dollar's purchasing power over time. If confidence in the US collapses, the dollar could lose its reserve status. We saw a small glimpse of this in 2020 and 2021 when the US printed trillions of dollars in stimulus. At first it seemed fine, but then inflation skyrocketed, the worst in 40 years. Prices on food, housing, and gas went up. People felt the real cost of money printing. So while the US has more flexibility than other nations, it still has to be careful. If too much money is printed too quickly, inflation could spin out of control. And if the world ever stops using the US dollar as the reserve currency, the financial system could change overnight. Next, we'll explore whether the US dollar is in danger, why countries like China and Russia want to replace it, and what could happen if the US ever loses its financial power. If you've made it this far, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Because what's coming next? It's something that could change the future of money forever. We now know that the US can print money without collapsing because of the dollar's special status as the world's reserve currency. The petrodollar system forces countries to use the US dollar, keeping demand high. But here's the question that most people aren't asking. What happens if the world stops trusting the US dollar? What happens if countries stop using dollars for trade? Could this cause a financial crisis that brings the US economy down? The truth is, this scenario is already starting to play out. Some countries are trying to move away from the US dollar, and if they succeed, it could change everything. Let's break it down. For decades, the US dollar has dominated global trade. US dollars for transactions. This was a wake-up call. Like China, Russia, and even some European nations have started looking for ways to reduce their dependence on the dollar. Why? Because the US has too much power over the global economy. Here's an example. In 2022, the US imposed sanctions on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. What did this mean? It meant that Russia was cut off from the US financial system. Banks, businesses, and even governments could no longer use US dollars for transactions. This was a wake-up call for many countries. Because if the US can freeze a country's assets and cut them off from the dollar, it means the US has too much control. So now, nations are asking, why should we keep relying on the dollar? Countries have started trading in other currencies to avoid the moment more countries stop using dollars, the US losing Chinese yuan instead of dollars. India and Saudi Arabia are exploring deals using local currencies. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are discussing creating their own currency to challenge the dollar. Even France, a US ally, made its first LNG trade with China in yuan instead of dollars. These changes might seem small, but they are a huge deal. Because the moment more countries stop using dollars, the US loses its biggest advantage. And if the US dollar is no longer the dominant currency, what happens next? Could the US dollar lose its reserve currency status? And if demand drops, the US loses its ability in the world. But history tells us that no empire lasts forever. In the past, other currencies held the title of world's reserve currency. In the 1600s, it was the Dutch guilder. In the 1800s, it was the British pound. And since World War II, it has been the US dollar. But nothing lasts forever. If more countries stop using the dollar, demand for US currency could drop. And if demand drops, the US loses its ability to print money without consequences. Inflation could skyrocket, interest rates could explode, and the entire US economy could change overnight. Is this happening soon? Probably not. But the seeds have already been planted. Countries are actively working to reduce their dependence on the US dollar. And if that trend continues, the US could lose the biggest financial advantage it has ever had. What happens if the US dollar loses its power? Using dollars, there would be less demand for US goods and what does that mean for everyday Americans? Here's what could happen. Higher inflation. The cost of goods could skyrocket as the US loses its financial power. Weaker global influence. The US wouldn't be able to sanction other countries as easily. Debt crisis. Without the ability to print money freely, the US government would struggle to pay off its massive debt. Economic slowdown. If the world stops using dollars, there would be less demand for US goods and services. For decades, the US has used the dollar's dominance to maintain its economic power. But if that power disappears, the US would have to completely change its approach to money, trade, and debt. And that could be one of the biggest financial shifts in modern history. Can the US prevent this from happening? So what can the 100 years before the dollar faces any real threat? What comes next? It's the part of the story that mean for the US economy, global trade, and everyday economic and political power. For example, the US pressures allies to continue using the dollar. The Federal Reserve controls interest rates to keep inflation in check. The US government monitors China and Russia's moves to challenge the dollar. But will this be enough? Some experts say the US has another 50 to 100 years before the dollar faces any real threat. Others believe that the shift is already happening. One thing is certain, the world is changing, and the next 10 to 20 years could reshape global finance in ways we've never seen before. Next, we'll explore what happens if the US can no longer print money freely. what an alternative world financial system could look like and how everyday people can protect themselves from future financial instability. If you've made it this far, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Because what comes next? It's the part of the story that no one is talking about. We've explored how the US has been able to print trillions of dollars without collapsing, thanks to the dollar's reserve currency status and the petrodollar system. We've also seen how countries like China, Russia, and the BRICS nations are working to reduce their reliance on the dollar, a move that could shake up the global economy. But here's the real question. What happens if the US can no longer print money freely? If the dollar loses its dominance, what does that mean for the US economy, global trade, and everyday people? And most importantly, how can you protect yourself? Let's break it all down. What happens if the US can't print money like it used to? Electronics, oil, food, raw materials, from around that, more than any country in history. Right good for everyday Americans. The stock market estate crisis, as borrowing becomes more expensive, the US can create more money without losing control. But if the world stops trusting the dollar, things could change overnight. Here's what could happen. The cost of living in the US would skyrocket. Right now, the US imports massive amounts of goods, electronics, oil, food, raw materials, from around the world. And because the world accepts dollars, the US can simply print money to pay for these imports. But if the dollar loses value, imports become much more expensive for Americans. Gas prices would explode, food prices would rise rapidly, manufacturing costs would go up, everyday goods would become far more expensive, leading to inflation that could cripple the economy. The US would struggle to pay its debt. The US owes more than $34 trillion in national debt, more than any country in history. Right now, the government can keep borrowing and printing more money to cover its obligations. But what happens if the world stops lending to the US? If countries stop buying US bonds, the government would have to raise interest rates dramatically to attract new lenders, print even more money, which could spiral into inflation, or cut government spending, meaning fewer public services, less funding for infrastructure, and potential economic slowdowns. The US would be forced to make difficult choices, none of which would be good for everyday Americans. The stock market and real estate could collapse. For decades, the US stock market and housing market have been fueled by cheap money. Low interest rates have allowed businesses to borrow and expand. The Federal Reserve has pumped money into the system, keeping the economy afloat. But if the dollar loses power, interest rates could skyrocket, and investors could lose confidence in US markets. This would lead to a stock market crash as global investors move their money elsewhere, a real estate crisis as borrowing becomes more expensive and demand drops, and a potential recession as businesses struggle to raise capital. Is the world ready to replace the US dollar? History tells us that financial power can shift, could replace the dollar. But the truth? There is no real alternative right now. The Chinese yuan is not fully convertible and is heavily controlled by the Chinese government. The euro is unstable due to economic issues within the European Union. And cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are not widely accepted as a true replacement for fiat money. So for now, the US dollar remains the dominant currency. But history tells us that financial power can shift. And if the world moves towards a multi-currency system, where trade is done in different currencies, the dollar could lose its special status. The question is, how long will that take? How can you protect yourself? If the US financial systems like gold, silver, or Bitcoin, the key is learn new income streams. If the US economy slows, their investments lose value, or when they're purchasing power, the thing you can do is have all your money in one place. If the dollar weakens, investors who only hold US assets will suffer. To protect yourself, own a mix of investments, stocks, real estate, commodities. Consider international assets that aren't tied to the US economy. Look at inflation-proof assets like gold, silver, or Bitcoin. The key is to not depend on one financial system. Second, reduce your dependence on debt. If inflation rises, interest rates will skyrocket. That means debt, especially credit card debt, will become much harder to pay off. Start by paying down high-interest debt as quickly as possible, avoiding unnecessary loans or financing, and building an emergency fund to avoid borrowing in the future. The less debt you have, the less you're at risk if financial conditions change. Third, learn new income streams. If the US economy slows down, jobs will become less stable. That's why it's important to start learning new ways to make money. Some ideas include online businesses or freelancing, investing in income-generating assets, and learning skills that are in demand globally. Having multiple sources of income makes you financially resilient. Fourth, stay educated on financial changes. Most people don't pay attention until it's too late. They only react when inflation is already out of control, when their investments lose value, or when their purchasing power drops overnight. But by staying informed, you can prepare in advance. Follow global financial trends, pay attention to shifts in government policies, and be proactive about protecting your money. Final thoughts. The future of the dollar. If you found this valuable, subscribe and turn on the notifications changing. And while the US dollar is still the strongest currency today, cracks are starting to appear. Countries are looking for alternatives. The debt is growing larger than ever. Inflation is becoming a bigger problem. What happens next? It depends on whether the US can maintain its financial dominance or if the world moves toward a new system. One thing is certain, those who prepare will always be ahead. So if you found this valuable, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Because in this channel, we don't just talk about money, we prepare for what's coming next. Drop a comment below. Do you think the US dollar will remain dominant or will another currency take over? Let's talk about it. See you in the next video.